I will take the opportunity to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on how you are joining us. And I think that we can start by welcoming everyone. My name is Maria Rombalcera, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the context in which we are meeting today. London Climate Action Week is taking place amid an extraordinary heat wave, and across the UK and Europe, transport systems are under strain, schools are adjusting schedules, health warnings are being issued, and communities are once again confronting the realities of a warming world. If anyone still believes that climate change is a distant threat, this week should be a reminder that it is not a problem of the future. It is a crisis unfolding now, disrupting lives, economies, and public services in real time. And perhaps this is a good moment to appreciate that we are gathering virtually. We know that meaningful participation in climate discussion should not depend on who can afford long-distance travel or secure a visa. And by meeting online, we are creating a more inclusive space, bringing together voices from different regions and experiences, while also reducing the carbon footprints associated with international travel. Last week, I was in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council discussing a new resolution on the adverse impact of climate change on human rights. The resolution reflects a growing recognition that climate change is a human rights issue and that climate finance is a legal obligation. Climate impacts undermine the right to food, water, housing, health, education, work, development, and ultimately life itself. And they are profoundly unequal. Women account for the vast majority of climate disaster displacement. Indigenous peoples, who protect many of the world's most important ecosystems, receive only a tiny fraction of the global climate finance. And communities that contributed least to the climate crisis continue to bear its heaviest burdens. This brings us directly to today's discussion. Climate finance is often presented as a technical subject, but climate finance is not just about money, it is about power. Who pays, who receives, who decides, and whose voices are counted. For too long, climate finance has been framed as generosity, but the legal and moral landscape is shifting. Recent advisory opinions from international courts have reinforced what many climate justice movements have been arguing for years, that responding to the climate crisis is not a matter of charity, it is a matter of justice, a legal obligation. And yet, current systems continue to fail on multiple fronts. It fails on quantity. Despite recent commitments, available resources remain far below what developing countries need to mitigate emissions, adapt to climate impacts, and address loss and damage. It also fails on quality. Too much climate finance arrives in the form of loans, pushing countries already struggling with debt further into financial distress. It fails on equity. Resources often bypass the communities most affected, including women-led organizations, indigenous peoples, and local communities. And it fails on governance. Decisions about climate finance continue to be concentrated among the most powerful actors, while those on the front lines have limited influence over how resources are allocated. At CESR, we often say that climate injustice does not emerge in isolation. It reflects and deepens inequality already embedded in our economic system. The climate crisis is inseparable from questions of debt, taxation, fiscal policy, and global economic governance. That is why today's webinar brings together experts working at the intersection of climate justice, economic justice, and human rights. We will explore not only what is wrong with the current system, but also the alternatives: progressive taxation, taxing extreme wealth, debt justice, climate reparations, right-based public finance, and approaches that place communities and human rights at the center of decision-making. We are incredibly fortunate to be joined by an outstanding panel. First, Mariana Paoli from Oxfam will help us unpack the relationship between climate finance and debt, and why current financing models are often worsening inequalities. I should note that Mariana may need to leave slightly earlier today because of schools in London are closing earlier than usual due to extreme heat. So I would encourage everyone to post questions for her in the Q&A throughout the session, and we will try to bring those to her before she has to leave. We will then hear from Uchisi Ngulube from Greenpeace Africa, who will share findings from Greenpeace's new report on climate debt and extreme wealth, and what this means for efforts to tax the super rich and finance climate action. Then we will hear from Rebecca Thyssen from CAN International, who will provide insights into how climate finance is being negotiated and shaped through the COP processes and other international fora, highlighting key risks and opportunities. And finally, my colleague Penina Mbabasi from CESR will bring together the lenses of climate justice, fiscal justice, and gender equality and human rights, helping us think about what a rights-based approach to climate finance could look like. We are also very fortunate to have my colleague Luke Holland, who will kindly moderate today's discussion and guide us through the presentations and the Q&A. My hope is that today's conversation will help us move beyond the jargon and complexity that often surrounds climate finance, because at its core, the debate is actually quite simple. The fiscal tools already exist. The resources exist. Communities are already demonstrating solutions that work. The question is whether we have the political will to redistribute resources, responsibility, and power in ways that make climate justice possible. Thank you very much, and over to you, Mariana.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maria, and good afternoon to everyone. This discussion is really timely, especially as we know how much the climate crisis and the debt crisis are very much intertwined, and they're caused by the same systems. We know that more resources flow from the global south to the global north than vice versa, not just because of in terms of debt repayments, but also due to debt and to the model prevailing on private sector first approaches. So we can't look at those in isolation. We know that today we have about 54 countries, as in 2025, who are in debt crisis, of which at least 48 of them are spending more money servicing their debt instead of health or education. In Africa alone, in 2024, there was an estimate of debt servicing of around 104 billion, while the investment on clean energy amounted for only 40 billion. And that's we're knowing that the amount of investment required in Africa to meet the SDGs would be at least 200 billion between now and 2030. So those issues are very much intertwined, and we know how much by that is really forcing countries in the global south to spend more money on this. Now, on the top of that, actually, the current system is forcing and encouraging a number of countries in the global south to explore their natural resources, continue to extract fossil fuels to repay this debt. So there is that economic dependence actually on fossil fuel extraction, because they need to generate the resources to meet these external debt payments. And that goes into that cycle that actually the climate impacts are worsening the debt crisis. And at the moment, when overseas development assistance is decreasing, there is less public money on the table, when developing countries, countries on the global south are actually forced to not just to go knock on the door of international financial institutions, but go out to borrow in the global markets. It costs them a lot more money, and this is really unfair. So addressing the cost of capital is something really essentially, especially because a result of those decrease of ODA and lack of public finance, we see that most of the climate finance provided in the form of loans. For example, when we look at the 100 billion from Copenhagen, at least, of 100 billion by 2020, which was the Copenhagen target, at least 70% were given in the form of loans, and actually commercial loans were included into that. So, and we know that even that climate finance is nowhere sufficient to meet the needs where these countries, and I'm sure we'll discuss later in this today in this webinar, but also the current politics are potentially hindering, not helping on this debt and climate nexus. So that's where it's really important for us when we think on climate finance to rethink the quality. So especially because there is a number of climate needs that cannot be met through private finance. We know how much for adaptation, for loss and damage, for just energy transition, how much public financing from our grants is actually the kind of finance that is really needed. In addressing the debt crisis, not just the debt cancellation, but also renegotiating of debt and how debt is made in the first place need to be addressed, and that's why there has been calls for quite a few years now from many countries from the global south, and it was a topic from the financing for development, the need for a debt sovereign mechanism, for a debt convention to be negotiated. Because as that saying goes, if you're not on the table, you are on the menu. And at the moment, it is the global north countries who are dictating the rules. So it's really essential to move that agenda forward and debunk some of the solutions who are not delivering. For example, very often debt swaps are promoted as part of the solution when in fact they don't really reduce debt levels or deliver on climate goals. They don't really figure any meaningful amount in terms of debt cancellation or restructuring. They often legitimize illegitimate debt, and they come with a number of conditionalities attached to them and excluding communities to decide on where and how those projects should happen, for example. And so when we look at the right instruments moving forward, it is essential to increase the fiscal space, to address the debt crisis in terms of cancellation and this restructuring. And when we look at the new climate finance mechanism moving forward, do not create more debt-inducing instruments. At the moment, it's really challenging under the current geopolitics with the refusal of developed countries to fulfill their mandate to provide that grants public finance at scale as they should to meet the needs of communities in the global south. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges that we have. Hopefully, that issue has been brought to the fore. A number of countries in the global south have been united in the climate negotiations and in other spaces, wanting to renegotiate that. And I think to some extent, when we saw for example, the transitioning away from fossil fuels conference that happened in Colombia back in April, economic dependency in the issue of debt has been on the fore. And moving forward is essential that that this becomes an essential pillar within the climate finance negotiations, knowing that, of course, that resolution needs to have its own place through a mechanism where the global south have voice and representation. That's why the need for the UN debt, a convention of some sort, but especially connecting the dots between what the likes of the MDBs and IMF are doing within the climate space is and negotiations is essential moving forward. So I just wanted to kick us off with this bigger picture on where we are, and I'm sure that my other colleagues here will include more details. Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and hello and welcome everybody. Luke Holland is my name. I'm with the Centre for Economic and Social Rights. I'm sort of sharing the moderation with Maria today. But thank you so much for your presentation, Marianne. It's certainly it's a grim picture, and everything you were saying towards the end there really speaks to about participation. Really speaks to how these multiple layers of enmeshed sort of trappedness in debt in debt are a crisis of democracy as much as, you know, we hear more and more this refrain that the climate crisis is a crisis of democracy, and I think it really speaks to that. So I'm going to turn to Uchizi from Greenpeace Africa. Please tell me if I mispronounced your name. I hail from Ireland, a country that is notorious for difficult to pronounce names. So I hope I didn't get it too wrong. But I know that you've been working on the issue of extreme wealth and its linkages to death, to death. There's a Freudian slip for you, and its linkages to debt. And I heard the figure that the wealthiest 0.01% are associated with nearly 1 trillion of debt a year, which is a really devastating figure. So I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit more about that and unpack the issues that you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Luke, for the introduction. I think you got my name spot on. So kudos for that. And yes, I will be speaking to a recent report that we produced as Greenpeace on high net worth individuals. And I'll just share a few slides on that to share some of the findings and also maybe a way forward for us all. So if you can just give me a second to share my screen. Okay, thank you once again. I hope you can see my slides. Yeah, so as Luke already mentioned in the introduction, Greenpeace recently launched a study on understanding the climate debt of extreme wealth, and I think it's quite relevant for the discussion today, looking at debt, but also how it intersects with climate finance. Yeah, so basically just a quick snapshot of the report itself. The report was trying to look at, we all know how the world's richest people basically are the ones who are driving a significant part of the climate crisis, particularly through their lifestyles, through their consumption, but also through their investment emissions. So climate debt is not only between countries, but also among the world's richest people. So what we wanted to know was to identify how much these rich individuals owe conceptually, and then also if they've made any responsible, if they were made, yeah, so basically look at how the polluter pays principle, but also to see and calculate how much this would be in monetary terms, and then also establish some next steps in terms of policies and the best ways to address this inequality between populations. So basically what was new in this report, because we are aware that there have been other pieces of research around this topic, was to basically put a dollar value on the climate debt of high net worth individuals. And this was done using the social cost of carbon approach, and then looking at how these emissions are connected to what high net worth individuals consume, but also what they invest. So basically the study had a two-lens approach, looking at consumption, but also looking at the investments of high net worth individuals. And then also looking at the annual climate debt, so a cumulative approach, looking at the past, but also looking at projections into the future in terms of what this climate debt looks like and what we can do to address this. So the report also goes further to look at estimating revenues from existing climate damage taxation tools that already exist. And then also looking at how the scale of this potential revenue would relate to the climate finance gaps that I think have already been discussed, looking at loss and damage, looking at adaptation, looking at mitigation as well. And then it also illustrates geographically how looking at the wealth of countries, but also looking at the climate vulnerability of countries. And again, that north-south divide was quite telling. So in terms of the actual findings of the report, as I mentioned, we had a two-lens approach for this piece of research, looking at consumption, but also looking at ownership-based climate debt. And this was an estimation basically looking at the excess emissions of high net worth individuals based on the pathway of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So basically looking at the total budget of carbon that we have as a globe, and then attributing that to, or that in terms of per capita, and putting a dollar value to that. And as you can see, looking at the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and then the top 0.01%, you can see that there is a serious concentration of climate debt attributed to the ultra high net worth individuals, or the centimillionaires in that top bracket. And just to put it into context, you can see that looking at comparing the top 10% and the top 0.01% wealth groups per capita, you can see that the climate debt per capita is almost 100 times more for the top 0.01% than the top 10%. And that just shows the concentration of debt in the highest income brackets. Similarly, for ownership-based emissions, you can see that the top 0.1% wealth groups are over 130 times higher than the top 10% wealth group per capita in terms of climate debt, which is also quite an important finding for this report, but it also just shows that concentration and where we should probably be channeling our policy interventions going forward. In terms of total debt, and this is where the famous figure of almost $1 trillion US is coming from, we estimated that from our findings, the ownership-based climate debt of the top 0.01%, so that top income group for 2022 was estimated at $992 billion US. And again, in terms of comparison, this is quite a huge figure in terms of what it could mean for our climate interventions as a globe, as countries, and also as regions going forward. And again, we used the same approach using the social cost of carbon estimation and multiplying this by the excess emissions of these wealth groups. And also another finding, obviously, is that the ownership-based emissions are much, much higher than the consumption-based emissions, which was another key finding. Moving forward, in terms of historical findings, so this is based on data from 1990 to 2022. If you were to accumulate all this climate debt, it would come to about $14.8 trillion US. And based on our projections, looking at the two lenses again, you can see that going forward, we can see that between 2023 and 2050, based on consumption, the climate debt would rise to about $40 trillion US. And on the other side, on the ownership-based climate debt, this would be at almost double or over double what it would be on the consumption-based approach at $81 trillion US from now to 2050. So in terms of policy gaps, there have been, and I think we acknowledge that there have been some very ambitious approaches or proposals for taxing the wealth and taxing high net worth individuals. Even ambitious combinations of luxury consumption and ownership wealth related taxes would cover just under a quarter, 23% of the estimates of annual consumption-based climate debt. So in terms of what we've estimated, these interventions would only cover a quarter, and also less than half of the annual ownership-based climate debt of the global top 0.1% wealth group. So you can see that even though we do have existing mechanisms for taxing wealth, they don't even come close to what we're estimating is the climate debt of these high net worth individuals. In terms of what this would mean, if you were to look at the figure again, almost $1 trillion US, this would cover what Climate Action Network, who are on the webinar as well. It would cover what they estimate is needed for climate action. I think this was an estimate from 2024 of $1 trillion US. Again, it would also cover what we estimate would be needed for loss and damage costs 2.5 times over. In terms of key takeaways, again, I think I've touched on a number of these. But basically, the climate debt rises sharply and non-linearly towards the top of the global wealth distribution. So the climate crisis is increasingly also a wealth concentration crisis, an inequality crisis. Similarly, ownership emissions are far more concentrated than consumption emissions, as I showed in the slides. The ownership emissions are much, much higher than consumption emissions. So ownership and investment-linked climate debt is substantially more concentrated within these than consumption. And that's where the biggest potential is. So I think that's where we should be concentrating our policy interventions. And then existing tax proposals, like I mentioned, do not match the scale of the climate debt. And then lastly, also looking at the climate debt in its geographically, we see that where the wealth is generated and where the climate vulnerability is also mismatched. So those countries that have the least wealth are the most impacted by climate. So I think I'll end there. Just a few contact details in case that are needed regarding the report. We did it in collaboration with FOS, who were the lead researchers. So just to highlight the challenge one last time, we know that high net worth individuals are responsible for a disproportionate share of climate debt, and that the current tax mechanisms do not effectively target these ultra wealthy individuals and groups when it comes to their climate debt. So I think the solution going forward would be for policy interventions to not only tax wealth, but also redistribute revenues based on the polluter pays principle, but also the common but differentiated responsibility principle to be applied to high net worth individuals. Thank you very much, Luke. I apologize if I went over time, but over to you. Thank you.
No, not at all. That was perfect in timing, and it was some of those figures are staggering. I mean, thank you so much for the work you're doing. And I have to admit, I was the inequality even within those kind of ultra high earning groups is just absolutely shocking. It's hard to grasp those figures, and the future projections are a little bit terrifying too. So I'm going to turn now. I think Rebecca is with us now from Cannes International. So hello there. It's good to see you. So I know you've been following the developments in the relevant negotiating spaces and the various conference of the parties meetings and other fora. So I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about how the climate finance landscape is being shaped by those political spaces and what the issues are.
Sure. Thanks, Luke, and hi everyone. Good to see you all. Apologies, it's really hot today, and so my brain is potentially not functioning properly. So I'll do my best to maybe talk you through a bit, yes, the history of climate finance, how it's now unfolding in the climate negotiation, and also how it's connected to other spaces and other discussions. But I'm really happy to come after Mariana and Gizi, sorry, because I think you build a very good picture about how this conversation on climate finance is connected to a broader question of the climate debt. And I think that's really the starting point. And this starting point has actually been recognized already early on in 1992 when we adopted the UNFCCC, so the UN Convention on Climate Change, under very important principles. And I would really like us all to stick to that principle because it tends to be diluted years after years, is a question of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is basically the principle that some countries, in particular global north countries, have benefited from the industrial revolution, have benefited from high emitting sectors and industries to develop, and so created and generated the climate crisis we know today. While on the other side, we have a vast majority of global south countries that have nothing to do with that historical responsibility and those historical emissions, and are actually now suffering the highest burden of the climate crisis. So that was really the genesis of this CBDR question of this principle, alongside with another very important principle that is equity. So we all agree that we have to aim for the common goals of the convention and then later on of the Paris Agreement. Think about the 1.5 target, for example, for 1.5 degrees target. But we also agree that we have different starting points. And that's really important. And so we have to understand that while we all collectively fight to tackle climate change, the means to do so are very different depending on if you're developing or a developed country. So later on, we had those principles embedded, and I think that moment in Rio was a lot of hope and joy, thinking we could together tackle the climate crisis. But then, of course, comes always a question of how we're going to implement high-level principles. And so specifically, how are we going to finance the transition and who is going to pay for it? And I think the question of responsibility and accountability is really what links all the negotiation from 1992 to today. And so the first moment where countries managed to get an agreement on the financing of the transition was in Copenhagen, so back in 2009. Where we had this first agreement that developed countries would provide $100 billion every year, we wish, every year from 2020 onwards until 2025. So that was the first climate finance goal that was adopted. And it was actually a major breakthrough, even though it was, of course, far less from meeting the needs of the developing countries. It had a lot of caveats in terms of responsibility, specifically when it comes to the quality of finance that was provided. But it was the first milestone towards potentially quantifying better this climate debt and making sure that this is part of the climate regime as a whole. We don't only talk about emission target, we don't only talk about adaptation, but we have this means of implementation and the funding to ensure that those targets are going to be met. This was later on confirmed in the Paris Agreement. So in 2015 in Paris, you may remember COP21 was a very important moment for the climate diplomacy and international negotiation. So not only this 100 billion goal was confirmed, so it was going to start in 2020, but also other important elements came in. For example, the idea that we need to balance finance between adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gases. So think about renewable projects, low carbon infrastructures, etc., which is often where the money goes. And we're going to look at the figures in a minute. But then there is also a very important part, and that's really critical for many countries in the global south, is the question of adaptation. So how do you build resilient agriculture, right? Cities that can cope with heat waves, just like today, etc., etc. And so those two pieces need very importantly funding at scale of the needs. And so that was recognized in the Paris Agreement, as well as a subtle but yet mention of loss and damage, which is another very important pillar of the climate negotiation, which is about things that you cannot adapt to any longer. So things that are basically lost because of the climate crisis, that could be material or immaterial. So those things were brought in thanks to the Paris Agreement, as well as a very important mention, and I will explain you why it's so important, the fact that developed countries have the obligation to provide public finance. So there we got a feed in the door saying, okay, we have this big goal, 100 billion goal every year, but we're also really clear about who is responsible to provide this money and what type of money needs to be provided, which is public finance. And you heard from previous speakers that there are a lot of conversation about the role of private finance, the role of loans, that is actually furthering the debt. But there we had this paragraph saying developed countries have the responsibility to provide qualitative public finance. So that was kind of the trend we were going on from 1992 to the Paris Agreement. Then we arrived in 2024 when we had to adopt a new goal. So we had this 100 billion goal between 2020 and 2025. And so the year before its deadline, we had to readjust and update the goal. So that's what happened in Baku in 2024, so at COP29. I don't know how many of you were there. I wish for you were not there because it was a very, very tough moment in terms of, centering justice, discussing equity, putting responsibility where it needs to go, because we went exactly the wrong direction, like opposite way of where we need to go in the context of such a climate crisis. So the new goal that was adopted, that's called the NCQG in the jargon, has got everything wrong in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, and in terms of responsibility. So I would not say that it got us backwards, because the 100 billion goal was already really poor, but it definitely set us on a very wrong path, including in terms of building trust among negotiations, because finance is not just there for the sake of having finance. It's like what links all the different pillars of the Paris Agreement together. And having such a weak agreement is actually putting everything under threat. When it comes to energy, fossil fuel phase out, when it comes to adaptation, when it comes to just transition, all those different pillars requires in the end finance that's provided at the scale of the needs. So since then, since 2024, I think maybe, and I'll wrap up there to not be too long, I think there are a few trends we need to be watching and monitoring and obviously fighting against. So the first thing is that we've been hearing over and over again, and since Paris, but I think what happened in Baku was the confirmation of that, is now that everybody should be responsible to provide climate finance. So this idea of a climate debt seems no longer to be so adequate. And so a lot of countries from the global north are saying, wait, actually other countries should also come in, right? They should also contribute because they are now richer, they are more developed. So why not China? Why not Saudi Arabia? And depending on who you talk to, the list changes. But that's, again, going exactly against the principle of CBDR and the idea of a climate debt. So that's something we have to be really clear about. There is an idea that some countries could voluntarily contribute to climate finance. It's also in the Paris Agreement. But it's not the same as conflating obligation and saying, oh, we are not all equally responsible to provide climate finance. So that's the first thing we need to be very clear on and really track when it comes to public narratives and speeches from different decision makers. The other trend we see is the idea that all sources are equally good for climate finance. So whether you think public, whether you think private, whether you think loans, whether you think grants, everything should be counted as climate finance. Obviously, what we have in the text is pretty ambiguous. So you could interpret it that way. If I was a developed country, I could say, but nothing in the Paris Agreement say that I cannot provide loans, right? But obviously, if you go back to the idea of a climate debt, so something that you own the whole world because of your own past emission, loans are not the vehicle to provide your climate finance and to repay your climate debt. Similarly, the private sector has a role to play in the transition. We all know that. There are huge gap of finance where the private sector would need to come in, but it's not the place to fill obligation from developed countries in the context of their climate finance commitments. So again, we're seeing this kind of confusion and slowly but surely erosion of responsibility and being unclear of where the money should come from, what type of sources, what type of instruments. So that's really our job as civil society to recall what's the starting point, which is a climate debt, and then where we need to go and through which instrument that guarantees quality. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm continuing to paint quite a doom landscape, but I think it's important to realize where we are So not only that the external context, looking at the debt crisis hitting the global south, the rising inequalities, including for the super rich, are, trends that we need to be worried on, but those have also influence on the climate finance debate. And it's our duty to connect those dots and have a consistent and coherent narrative to really make sure we hold polluters and responsible into account. So thanks, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Don't apologize for the doom and gloom. I mean, I completely agree that I mean, obviously we have to be clear and honest in our assessment of where we are and the trajectory that we're seeing, and it's certainly very frustrating to see so many of the most responsible actors trying to sort of wriggle their way out of, and present arguments to evade responsibility. If ever there was a moment in our collective history when we need clarity and just integrity from the powers that be in this world in order to have effective multilateralism, it is obviously now. So I'm going to turn to my colleague Penina, who can talk to us a little bit about just that, about what a sort of a justice-centered approach to these issues that incorporates and is anchored in human rights standards and gender equality would look like. And just before I pass over to you, I just invite all our guests here who are listening that if you have questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please do feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or to drop any questions into the chat, and we'll get into them shortly. So over to you, Penina.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for being so elaborate in sharing a lot of the different aspects. I'll just also add our voice as CSR, looking at how climate finance, or where we need to look at how the human rights perspective should be at the center of a lot of the discussions going around in climate finance. But I'll just give a context. Of course, already from what we know is that we have seen, of course, the different reduction when it comes to public climate finance and the challenges that we've seen with global South countries in trying to also raise resources that could support a lot of already the cuts that they're facing with the development assistance, but also the challenges in how they are still failing to invest in social sectors or social spending, specifically for health and education. These have been some of the impacts that the climate crisis has created, but more so in regards to financing. When it comes to some of these aspects, it's that we're not seeing a lot of countries being able to meet these domestic needs, but also the ecological debt is also staggering. And of course, nearly 2/3 of climate finance, which already has been emphasized by my colleagues, is really made as in the form of loans than grants. And most of it has come with a lot of high concessions. But specifically, when we're looking at the inequality, or that who falls and pays in regards to this crisis, we see that there's really a gap in how climate finance is unevenly distributed in regards to the women and girls who bear disproportionate burden from unpaid care work, also the loss of livelihood when adaptation and public services are underfunded, but also the austerity driven by debt distress, which I was just mentioning really about the cuts that much of these services are facing, that reduces also still on, increases the vulnerability. So when we look at, the human rights aspect, is that as CSR, we have continued to still emphasize that we need to emphasize the need to integrate climate finance, not just looking beyond the flow of funds meant to address the climate crisis, but also emphasizing how these resources should actually be refocused or reimagined to have a rights-based approach. And so many of the different civil society organizations, as well as the different organizations represented here, have continuously emphasized the need for human rights language, as well as a human rights approach in so many of these aspects. So when it comes to emphasizing, even from the advisory opinions, looking at the ICJ and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which does bring a lot of clarity in reinforcing what movements have emphasized, that climate finance should be a legal obligation and not charity, but also understanding how the struggles of climate justice should be inseparable from the fight for economic justice and gender justice. And we see that even with the different UN basic principles on the right to remedy and reparations, they still outline that what justice must look like for communities experiencing climate-related harm, and the forms of redress that should guide the design and delivery of climate finance. But we also emphasize that without fair taxation and debt justice, climate finance commitments definitely continuously still get to be highly, impacted. But the retrogression of human rights obligations, not just as a policy shortfall, continuously show that a lot of the challenges that we see today is that no one is willing to take the blame. Most countries are trying to avoid commitment, and most of the global South countries continuously face these challenges. So our principles to what a just climate finance system should look like is that we believe that there should be a redistributive, it should be distributive, meaning that resources should flow from those who are most responsible for climate breakdown to those that are most affected by it, based on capacity and not charity. And also it should be reparative, meaning that funding is grounded in historical accountability and includes compensation for past harms, not just future risks. And also we believe that it should be rights-based, meaning that finance is not conditional or donor-driven. It should uphold international obligations and center the dignity and agency of affected communities. And we also believe that it should be people-powered in the sense that communities on the front lines of the crisis shape decisions about how funds are raised, governed, and spent. But also, it should be systemic. Climate finance is linked to deeper reforms in debt, tax, trade, and investment rules, building the fiscal space and democratic power needed for a just transition. We still see that, of course, a lot of this falls on the change that we need to see when we talk about the global financial architecture, the reforms that we want to see there, but also focusing that we need to continuously ensure that tax justice or debt justice does deliver climate justice and also gender justice. But we continuously see that while we need to emphasize that there's need to bring all these together, climate finance systems should be funded through progressive and redistributive taxation, which means fiscal justice. But we emphasize that they must be delivered as grants and not debt, protecting the state capacity to fulfill rights, and include gender responsive and safeguards, as well as human rights safeguards, to ensure that we're able to understand that also these are also important aspects that we need to see that climate finance is able to meet. So it's not that we continuously fail to understand as global South countries that there is need to ensure that we continuously demand for climate finance to be human rights centered, or at least have a human rights based approach. But we also need to interrogate a lot of what we claim as the funds being received, those that for many times countries have failed to receive adequate financing, and still it's been challenged to how it's being spent on ground, and also how who is actually being able to receive these funds. So there is definitely a need to see that the struggle for climate justice is inseparable from the fight of economic and gender justice, and as well as human rights approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Penina. And yeah, I mean, it's there's some solace in looking at, you know, we the solutions. We know what the pathway to a better world looks like and what it involves. And I think that's something that's coming through with all of the presentations we've heard today. Thank you to our panelists. We have some time for a little bit of dialogue and Q&A. So I see we have, well, first of all, I will just say again to everyone in the who is in attendance that do feel free, if you have a question, to drop it in the chat or use the Q&A function. And also you can just raise your hand and we can allow you to speak directly. So I see there are a couple of questions there that have been dropped into the Q&A. First of all, I'm guessing this might be a question for you, Uchizi. Does the debt of the top 0.01% also factor in spending through trust funds and other similar vehicles? That's from Dhruv Gavde.
Should I answer that now? Or?
Yeah, if you could come in on that, that would be great. Maybe we could just answer it live. Sorry, I should have said.
Yeah, I think in terms of what the coverage is, the report did focus on wealth, and I think we did make a distinction between what wealth is and what assets are. So basically, the report does cover income generating assets, and sometimes that can include what was mentioned, like trust funds and so on. So in a nutshell, it includes wealth, and the data set does include assets that do generate wealth. I hope that answers.
Thank you so much. And I see another question here from Martina Solate. To what extent do you believe, and this could probably be to any one of the panelists, so to what extent do you believe the UN Tax Convention negotiations can lead to the implementation of equitable and fair tax instruments based on CBDR? What is needed to ensure this happens, especially in light of current challenges to multilateralism posed by the US? Would anyone like to come in on that?
Yeah, maybe I can come in again.
That would be great. Please do.
Yeah. If I got the question correctly, it's basically looking at how the UN Tax Convention would be a solution to these problems that we're currently facing, based on principles like the common but differentiated responsibility, and then also looking at some of the challenges we're experiencing with the US. Maybe I'll start with that, the last point on the US. When it comes to the UN Tax Convention, I think the overall idea, the overall push for it was to increase representation of Global South countries. The current tax landscape is very much skewed towards rich countries through the OECD, for instance, through IMF policies that advise on regressive taxation and so on. So basically, the UN Tax Convention is what we see as the solution towards increasing representation, increasing the say that developing countries have when it comes to how tax policy is formulated at global levels. Based on that and membership within the UN itself, you will see that there is quite a clear divide in terms of countries that are in support of it and countries that may not be in support. But at the end of the day, once this framework convention is adopted by the United Nations and is in effect, I think it would help in terms of correcting some of the challenges that we face in terms of climate, but also more broadly speaking, when it comes to sustainable development, when it comes to addressing illicit financial flows, that would in turn hopefully allow developing countries to collect more, to generate and mobilize more resources, and address some of the challenges that have been outlined in terms of loss and damage, in terms of adaptation, and so on. In terms of the common but differentiated responsibility principle, I think it does, within the UN Tax Convention, I think there is an overlap. There is room for similar principles to be applied within the UN Tax Convention. Like I did mention, the sustainable development is a very key article when it comes to the UN Tax Convention. And in that, there is need for us to also allocate responsibility, but also identify the disparities and the inequalities that exist within the current policy landscape, and how the UN Tax Convention can then address those challenges. So I hope that answers the question. It obviously will not be a silver bullet towards the problems that we face, but I think it's the best solution in terms of going forward and in terms of tax policy at a global level.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Uchizi. And Rebecca, I saw you had your camera on for a moment. Did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, but I think you answered it really well. So I don't have much to add, but it's indeed, I think, a very important question and an important development that we need to monitor in terms of how do we connect better the UNFCCC conversation and this question of how do we increase public grant-based climate finance and what the UN Tax Convention could generate. And of course, behind this is the question on one hand of CBDR. So how do we make sure historical emitters, global north countries increase their budget sufficiently to meet the climate finance obligation? And I mean, not only climate finance, obviously, development and other international commitment they have, but also how do we increase fiscal and policy space in the global south to ensure that they have a sufficient domestic resource mobilization to meet their own needs as well. So I guess the UN Tax Convention is touching on both across the different articles that we see now in the drafts. There is a particular article on the question of progressive environmental taxation that would be very important to make polluters pay. But yeah, so there is clear links between the two. But I think that would also require more efforts from our end to make those connections more tangible, knowing that the negotiators are very different, right? You have the finance, foreign affairs ministry on one hand, and then you have climate or environment people that do not necessarily talk to each other, even within the same country. So connecting those dots and also maybe raising the question at a more of a political level. So not only technicians, fine-tuning the best fiscal paragraph, but also understanding the bigger political opportunity we have between those two conventions would be important. And just maybe because I'm speaking, I also wanted to pick up on one of the questions that was raised about the fact that we are in a totally new order now, and I think it's a very important one. I totally agree, and you're potentially right that we didn't manage to flag it enough. Although I think Maria in her introduction was also clear about the fact that 2026 is definitely not 2025 any longer, and of course what we are observing is just a continuation of an imperialist agenda and a reshuffle of global geopolitics, but it has also to question us on how do we approach the climate finance conversation, and also its actors and institutions. And I think in the question, the Bretton Woods institution were mentioned specifically, and it's a very interesting situation we are in now. Just think, for example, about the role MDBs are supposed to take in the climate finance delivery, right? They've been positioned as the key channel to provide climate finance. And specifically that has been confirmed in the latest climate finance goals I was talking about. But now we see that they are potentially backtracking on their climate commitment as a whole through the climate change action plan and the pressure faced on the World Bank and the other MDBs by certain countries. So I think we also have maybe to use this moment of crisis to rethink a bit what can we do in the current context and what would work, understanding that it's an opportunity also to rebalance the global order and maybe move away from creditor Northern-led institutions, such as the Bretton Woods, but obviously they are not the only ones. And sorry, then I'll wrap up. I think there was also a question about the question of the contributor base, and so whether Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries are still a valid distinction. I hear that, and I mean, it's a debate that I've been following for maybe a decade now. No, I'm not that old, but almost. So it's an important question, like, right, the question of capacity. So because when we speak about CBDR, so common but differentiated responsibility, actually the full principle is also respective capability. So it's CBDR-RC. So the question of respective capabilities is a very important one. And we know that many global south countries are actually already doing a lot more than is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Think about China and the amount of climate finance they do provide to other global south countries, right? So this is happening. That said, I feel that this argument of, like blurring the line between Annex 2 and Annex 1 countries is often used for global north countries to not have to meet their obligation any longer. So one thing is to ensure that past commitments and historical responsibility are recognized, and so the promises are met. And then the other question is, who else can we invite to contribute? Maybe under a different regime, through voluntary obligation, through increased transparency. There are many things that could be done and that could be discussed. But we have to understand that in the current context, specifically in light of the mistrust that is, unfolding in every negotiation rooms, this conversation has to be approached in good faith and not as a negotiating tactics to dilute obligation and put the burden on others that have not necessarily the same responsibilities. So the debate is on the table, but I think we have to make sure we approach it in the right way through the right principles. Thanks. Sorry, look, I was a bit long, but so that I could cover some.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And yeah, they're both very, very pertinent and difficult questions, I think. I'd love to have just straight, easy answers for them. But I don't. Before I move on to the next question, would Uchizi or Penina, would you like to come in on either of those issues? The reshaping, the rapidly evolving global world order, so to speak, and this question of the Annex 1, Annex 2 binary? And if not, I can move on.
I think, yeah, you can move on. I think I also agree with what Rebecca has mentioned also, but also Mariana did mention earlier. But also I could add maybe, the push for, a UN debt convention, really. Part of that is also basically looking at restructuring or reforming the architecture, the debt architecture. So there is need to still look at backing some of those discussions and also pushes that we want to see that global south countries also are able to have and meet their fiscal, get fiscal space, but also meet the other commitments, development commitments. Yeah, so reform would be great.
Maybe to add, yeah, I think in terms of New World Order and how this relates, I think it's been up for debate for a number of years in terms of how we can restructure the global financial architecture. And I think there are several parts to this, including already existing mechanisms. I think there was discussion on COP earlier and how this conference of parties addresses some of these issues when it comes to climate. But I think also similarly, I think there was also mention of, for instance, the UN Tax Convention. There's also ideas around a global debt convention as well, which would then feed into the global financial architecture being or addressing some of these critical elements that are affecting so many countries, particularly developing countries in the global south. Also, just to highlight, I think, or just to re-emphasize, I think there is need for immediate action when it comes to how countries are being forced to choose between providing and financing this climate crisis at the same time being heavily indebted and channeling those funds towards interest payments, which are usually quite high in terms of comparing developing countries and developed countries in terms of the cost. So I think we do need to move away and find solutions that are like Pennifer mentioned, upholding human rights and allowing countries to invest in sectors such as health, education, and so on. So maybe just to add to that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So Lydia Bennett asks, what are your opinions on debt for nature swaps? Do you think these are positive mechanisms or perpetuate continuing power imbalances between the global north and south? Any thoughts on this question?
Maybe I could share.
Please do.
In regards to a lot of the different instruments, also called solutions in quotes, that usually have been proposed, and debt for nature swaps has been one of them. But with the clear examples that you see, they're not really the solutions to the debt crisis or the climate crisis, because you still find countries have less and continuously still have a less fiscal space, but also not the solution that would be ideal would be in seeing that we instead do not encourage more, indebtedness and more on loans and rather than grants, because you get find still a lot of those so-called solutions do take a lot more toll on global south countries, especially given that some of them become indirectly not only through the negotiations, but even for just structurally, they continuously to perpetuate inequality, structural inequality. So even for those that are, for example, into carbon trading, into some of those as solutions, we're seeing that on ground, they continuously instead impact communities. So even for debt for nature swaps is that you'd be actually seeing a lot of the communities that are really relying on some of this, on the nature, on some of these are solutions, back home would definitely be impacted. And instead it would look like you're actually just mortgaging, your country for more indebtedness. And yet the solution shouldn't be that. The solution should be about trying to see that we have comprehensive debt cancellation, but also seeing that we have a lot of reform in regards to debt sustainability assessments that are carried out, that for countries that get highly impacted by the climate crisis, they can be able to have a lot of, at least some bit of flexibility to create a lot of fiscal space for any debt payments, but to also see that they can have other functional solutions. And debt for nature swaps is just one that continuously countries falling more into debt and less into supporting a lot of their development needs. And and they're surely complex. But that's just what would be ideal, that we kind of move away from such instruments.
Maybe just to add very quickly on that. I think debt for nature swaps is something that we've seen gaining some momentum as a solution, particularly again for low-income countries. But I think as Pennifer has mentioned, it does, at the end of the day, first and foremost, it does perpetuate this inequality that we see. We know that countries already cannot afford or have. We know that these developing countries contribute the least towards the climate crisis. They're already poor and they already lack the means to act. But at the same time, they're also heavily indebted. And debt for nature swaps have been proposed as this solution, but obviously they do undermine these livelihoods of these countries, and they do not propose or they do not offer a lasting solution towards being a substitute for real debt restructuring at that level. We know that we've seen restructuring in many countries, and then a decade later, they're back where they started. So I think debt for nature swaps again do not provide that long-lasting solution towards the debt crisis. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uchizi. And we have another question. Well, again, on this question of the new world order. I mean, the term new world order I always associate with the darkest of dystopian kind of literature, but it can feel like that's where we're headed. What Melissa asked, what part of the new world order do you want ideas on? I guess she's responding to the previous question. For example, the UN Tax Convention is a power shift to the global majority, potentially. And yeah, I mean, the UN Tax Convention, I will take the liberty of just weighing in myself. I think so, it's obviously very significant that the UN Tax Convention process was pushed forward by and spearheaded by the Africa Group and sort of wrested control of the international tax negotiations from the OECD, which had demonstrated itself over an extended period of time to be a channel for neo-colonial economic extraction of the global south. And so there is something, it is certainly the fact that it's happening. Is emblematic of a welcome power shift. What will happen in the negotiations over the next 18 months waits to see to what extent it can deliver on that potential. But I think of this question of the new world order, it's very difficult because, I mean, somebody said to me recently, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it didn't die in a day either. So I think a lot of organizations and people are wrestling with and struggling with that question of are these institutions of power of international governance, are we yet at the place where we should just be walking away from them, from those spaces and trying to delegitimize them, or is there still potential for something positive to come? Speaking purely for myself, I don't think there's a very easy answer to that question. So I will stop rambling on. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in and say anything on that question of the tax convention, or the shift of the shifting sands of the kind of institutions of global power. Please do. And if there are any other questions from our attendees, please feel free to raise your hand or comment through the Q&A. Any takers? Okay. We have another question here. How can developing countries practically use the ICJ's 2025 advisory opinion to effectively pressure major emitters into delivering on their climate finance obligations? Anyone would like to come in on that question?
Sorry, did you? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you've a response to that question, and what is the potential there of how should developing countries use the 2025 advisory opinion?
Yes, of course, with the advisory opinions, it's one of those that are not just simple. They have created like a huge change in having a bit of an authoritative interpretation from the world's highest courts, which really continuously have emphasized that human rights and climate finance are legally intertwined and not optional or aspirational, but that states must mobilize accessible, sufficient, equitable finance as a legal obligation. But also they come in as ways that for developing countries that are challenging issues, these are one of the different tools, or should we call it ways of being, we can use the advisory opinions in shaping a lot of today's discussions in how to get a lot of responsibility for, developed countries to pay their fair share. Some of it definitely comes in saying that climate finance obligations should be emphasized, but also the need to center a lot of what a lot of movements have been emphasizing, calling for climate reparations to be enforceable, including the aspects of restitution, compensation, and rehabilitation. Means that we can still ensure that not only international courts, but also even in our own local jurisdictions, that we should be able to, call for justice where there has been climate harm, but also call to see that there's an obligation that should be met. And the advisory opinions creates that. So it's really showing that there's a rights-based approach to climate finance and empowering those that are most affected in seeking redress for injustice, but also reshaping the systems that have caused the crisis. So we just have to put them into use, using them as implementing tools, but also in ways to safeguard, and benchmark on countries that have actually been able to take some of these, definitely if it's corporations to court, and actually been able to get fair redress. So I believe that's an opportunity for us, and again.
Right. Thank you so much. And I think this next question, it might be one for you, Ichizi. What do you think is the connection of the polluter pays progressive taxation of high net worth individuals to the debt relief needs?
Yeah, it looks like it's a question for the audience, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, maybe just to give a quick answer. In terms of progressive taxation of high net worth individuals, yeah, I think as we highlighted in the report, high net worth individuals are responsible for a higher proportion of emissions, and by our calculations, climate debt or debt owed to the planet than lower income groups. So obviously there is definitely a connection in terms of the polluter pays principle that I think we've been discussing quite a lot on this call. But maybe just to emphasize that I think there is a very direct connection between emissions and those who emit, in terms of the inequalities that exist and how progressive taxation addresses those inequalities. Taxation is quite a powerful tool in terms of its redistribution capabilities. And redistribution is not only between income groups, it can also be between income groups of individuals rather, but also between countries. Like we've mentioned, there are stark inequalities between income of individuals, but also income of countries. And I think our report does highlight some of those disparities between countries. And based on the polluter pays principle, there should be ways, there should be policies that exist that strongly address these inequalities for the greater good of the planet, but also for inclusive development as a collective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I see Lydia has asked for each of the panelists, which if you could implement one solution without barriers, what would it be? I'm going to suggest we just hold that for a minute because that's a fun question, and we're heading towards the sort of final furlong of this webinar. So maybe we could first take. I see Charlotte Richmond has her hand up. So Charlotte, I'm going to allow you to speak, and yeah, if you've got a question, I think we should be able to hear you now. Do you want to go ahead? Now you seem to be muted.
No, that was a mistake. Sorry.
Oh, okay, you didn't want to raise your hand. Okay, no problem. No problem at all. So yeah, if you could, let's say, so I guess we could, each of the panelists can maybe go in turn. If you could implement one solution without barriers, what would it be? How about, do you want to jump in first, Benina? Benina, can you hearing me okay?
Sorry, just repeat the question.
If you could implement one solution without barriers, what could it be? And this is someone who's asked this for each of the panelists, so maybe we can do a round robin on this one.
Well, I kind of have like, I imagine there's quite a number that I could, well, one solution without barriers. I feel that one of those could be, of course, looking at debt cancellation, but calling for, still the approach of calling for UN debt convention. I feel that could be one solution because it does tackle the need for reform of the global financial architecture, but also the financial architecture. So it's one of those solutions, of course, still quite in the process, but I believe that it's still a solution at the end where we could justify a lot of what would need to look like for reform and what just climate finance would look like.
Okay, thank you. And Uchizi?
Yeah, thanks, Luke, and thanks, Lydia, for that question. Yeah, I think for me, in terms of one solution, I'm trying to think of something that covers everything. I would say fair and progressive taxation. It's something that I think we've all conceptualized in various different ways, but has several barriers in terms of its actual implementation. So I think fair and progressive taxation would first and foremost address the inequalities that we see between countries in terms of taxing rights that many developing countries are deprived of. At the same time, it would also allow for the redistribution of resources between the richer and the poorer, between climate vulnerable nations and wealthier ones. I think that would be my one solution if it had no barriers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Rebecca, are you there? Would you like to come in and?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry, I'm in a bit of a noisy place
Okay.
right now, but I hope you can hear me. It's a very good question. I think it forces us to think a bit more towards solutions and not only barriers. I don't have the perfect answer to it. I would tend to agree with what Penina and Ujide said. But maybe one thing I think we should also aim towards, even though it's more of a long shot, obviously, is the question of reforming the economic governance system as a whole. And obviously that goes through the UN tax convention question, the UN debt convention, but more systematically think how we can bring global South voices to the table And not only just because, we want equal voice between North and South, but just because this is how the transition should be led. And this is where, the most of the transition and the upcoming effort will come from, with all its potential. So we really need to readjust the current structures and decision-making structures to reflect the reality we are in. If there was no barriers, of course.
Indeed, thank you so much. Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to take the liberty of putting in, even though I'm not a panelist, but I do take link to that question of reform of our governance and policy spaces. I think there's, yeah, one of the things that's very interesting is the proliferation of citizens' assemblies we've seen in many countries, where when ordinary citizens are given the information and asked to think about the issues, they generally choose very, very progressive policies to the full spectrum of these issues. So radical democratization, I would say. So we're coming up on time. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I think we can probably start to wind it down. I want to really thank all of our panelists and everybody who joined us today. It was a really, really rich conversation. It was depressing and shocking in some ways, but it's also clear that the resources are there and the solutions are there for many of these problems, but we live in very tumultuous times, and we've got a hell of a fight ahead to try and push some of these solutions forward. So we weren't gonna come to final solutions to all these problems today, but I hope we can all continue to be in contact and continue to talk and dialogue and continue to fight. I am going to just drop my email address into the chat in case anybody would like to get in touch and carry the conversations forward. And with that, I will just say thank you and goodbye. Are there any final reflections from any of our panelists just before we wind up?
I think
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Say thank you. Thank you, and to the panelists, thank you for joining. And I'll just also share our Decoding Climate Finance by the Center for Economic and Social Rights in collaboration with Utah, just on decoding climate finance. And it could be one of those that you could use to champion some of the messages that you've heard here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, similarly, I think thank you to everyone who joined. I think I'll also be sharing our climate debt report that I was speaking to. I'll share a link to that in the chat as well. But thank you once again for the collaboration, and do stay in touch.
Thank you so much. Any final word from you, Rebecca?
Okay. I also will be happy to share resources that we put together on the first edition of the Cannes Finance School, which is aiming at attacking key topics that are emerging in the climate finance debate. The first edition was focusing on private finance. And so, yeah, all the different risks and problematic narrative we see emerging, and, unpacking also the technical question behind it. So we have a toolkit and recordings of the different sessions of the school. So I'll be happy to share that with you, Luke, and then you can share that with the participants if that works.
Okay. That sounds great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for everybody for joining us. And have a beautiful day. Be well.